The afternoon sun hung low over the quiet town of Willow Creek, casting golden light through the windows of Willow Creek Private Hospital. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly as Clara Evans walked down the clean white halls, her nurse's shoes tapping against the tiled floor. She'd been a nurse here for 2 years, caring for patients with broken bones or fevers, but today felt different. The moment she got the unexpected call to Dr. Miles's office, the head of neurology, a strange feeling settled in her chest. Had she made a mistake? Was she being moved to another ward? She took a deep breath before knocking on the polished wooden door. "Come in," Dr. Miles's voice called. Stepping inside, she found him standing by the window, hands behind his back, his sharp eyes fixed on the town below. His office smelled of clean antiseptic and old books, the air heavier than usual. Clara shifted on her feet, waiting. "Clara," he said at last, turning to her, his voice calm but serious. "We have a patient who needs special care. This job isn't for everyone." Her brows furrowed. "What kind of patient?" she asked carefully. Dr. Miles looked at her for a moment, then pointed to a thick file on his desk. "Carlos Navarro." Clara's breath stopped short. Carlos Navarro, the Carlos Navarro, was a name everyone in Willow Creek knew. At 31, he'd built Turner Mills, the biggest lumber company in the state, turning forests into fortune. His face had been on every local paper, his deep voice a staple at town meetings. A year ago, he'd disappeared from the news after a terrible logging accident. His truck had crashed down a steep hill, leaving him in a coma ever since. People said he'd been reckless. Others whispered it wasn't an accident. "His family doesn't come around much," Dr. Miles went on, his tone steady. "His parents are too old. His sister's busy with the business, and most of the staff here just do the bare minimum. Carlos needs someone who'll care, really care." Clara bit her lip, hearing the weight in his words. "And you think that's me?" Dr. Miles nodded. "I do." She took a slow breath. Taking care of a man who might never wake up, a man whose strength once shaped the town, was a big task. But deep down, she knew her answer before she said it. She'd never walked away from someone in need, not since she lost her brother to illness years ago. "I'll do it," she said. Dr. Miles's lips pressed into a thin line, but his eyes showed approval. "Good. You start tonight." The private room on the top floor felt strangely quiet as Clara stepped inside. Unlike the cold, plain patient rooms below, this one was warm and grand. Wide space, soft lights hanging from the ceiling, dark wood furniture, all around. A big window looked out over the pine-covered hills. In the middle of it all lay Carlos Navarro. Her breath caught as she saw him. Even with the tubes and machines keeping him alive, he was handsome. Strong jaw, dark hair against his pale skin, broad shoulders under the hospital gown. If not for the stillness, he could have been sleeping after a long day in the woods. But this wasn't sleep. This was a man trapped in a deep, endless quiet. Clara swallowed hard and stepped closer, adjusting his IV drip before picking up the warm cloth ready for him. She paused for a second, then gently pressed it to his skin. The moment she touched him, a weird chill ran up her back, a feeling she couldn't explain. Like he knew she was there, like somewhere in his silent mind he felt her. A soft beep from the heart monitor broke the quiet, steady, and even. She shook off the odd sensation and kept going, wiping his arms, his chest, making sure he was clean and comfortable. "Guess you don't get a vote in this, huh?" she murmured, almost to herself. Silence. "I'll take that as a no." A small smile pulled at her lips despite the stillness. The days turned into a routine. Every morning and evening, she'd bathe him, change his sheets, check his machines. But soon, it wasn't just about the job. She started talking to him, sharing bits of her day, the world outside his window. You should see the rain out there, Carlos, she said one evening, dipping the cloth in warm water. The hills are soaked. Looks like a mess. Bet you'd have handled it better than anyone. Silence. I don't even know why I'm talking to you, she added softly. Maybe I just like hearing myself. Silence again. Or maybe you're listening. The heart monitor beeped steadily, almost like it was answering her, and maybe, just maybe, he was. Clara hummed softly as she dipped the clean washcloth into the warm water, the quiet of Carlos Navarro's private hospital room wrapping around her like a blanket. She'd grown used to the steady beep of the heart monitor, the faint hum of the machines keeping him alive. It was just another evening in their routine. She leaned over the bed, carefully wiping his face, her fingers gentle but sure. You know, she said, her voice light, I read somewhere that people in comas might hear things. So technically, you're the worst listener I've ever met. No response, of course. She sighed, shaking her head with a small smile. It's okay, I'm used to talking to myself now. She moved to clean the curve of his jaw when she felt it, a slight movement. Her breath caught. Had she imagined it? She froze, staring at his hand. Nothing. The fingers lay still against the white sheets. She let out a shaky laugh. Great. Now I'm seeing things. Maybe I need the hospital bed. But the unease stayed with her, a quiet ripple in her mind. Over the next few days, it happened again. The second time she was adjusting his pillow, her eyes elsewhere, when she felt the faintest pressure against her wrist. Her head snapped down. Carlos's hand had shifted just a tiny bit, but enough to make her stomach flip. Carlos, she whispered, barely realizing she'd said his name. Silence. The same steady beep, beep, beep of the monitor. She placed her hand over his, feeling his warmth, his stillness, the hint of something more. Was she imagining it, or was something changing? She couldn't shake the feeling, so she told Dr. Miles. The doctor raised an eyebrow, skeptical. I think so, Clara admitted, her voice unsure. At first I thought it was nothing, but it keeps happening. His fingers twitch, his hand moves a little. It's small, but it's there. Dr. Miles leaned back in his chair, thinking. We'll run tests, he said finally. But don't get your hopes up, Clara. It could just be reflexes. She nodded, but deep down she didn't believe it was just reflexes. Something was happening. She could feel it. Weeks passed, and the routine held steady until one rainy Tuesday evening. The wind howled outside, rattling the big window overlooking the hills. Clara was bathing Carlos, the cloth warm against his chest, when his fingers tightened around her wrist. Weak, shaky, but real. She gasped, the basin slipping from her hands and splashing water across the floor. Carlos? Her voice trembled as she stared at his hand, then his face. His eyelids fluttered, and then they opened. Deep brown eyes, clouded with confusion, locked onto hers. Where am I? He whispered, his voice rough and faint. Clara's whole body froze, her knees weak, her breath stuck somewhere between shock and panic. He spoke. He woke up. The impossible had just happened. She stumbled back, barely noticing the water soaking her shoes. Oh my God, she breathed, her instincts kicking in. She turned and slammed her hand against the emergency button on the wall. A loud alarm screamed through the hallway. Seconds later, the door burst open, and a team of doctors and nurses rushed in, led by Dr. Miles. What happened? He demanded, moving to Carlos's bedside, already checking his pulse. Clara's voice shook. He grabbed my hand. He opened his eyes. She looked back at Carlos, still unable to believe it. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his eyes darting around the room, trying to make sense of where he was, what was happening. He wasn't fully awake, not yet, but he was here. Dr. Miles's face shifted from shock to focus. Get me a neurological team now. Nurses scrambled, voices overlapping in disbelief as they hurried to run tests. The room turned into a storm of movement, but Clara couldn't look away from Carlos. Then, as if he felt her staring, his eyes found hers again, and this time they didn't leave. Everything moved fast. Doctors asking him questions, shining lights in his eyes, testing his hands and feet. But through it all, Carlos's gaze kept drifting back to Clara. She stepped forward, her throat tight, swallowing hard. "Carlos," she whispered, "do you remember anything?" He stared at her, blinking slowly. A long silence stretched between them. Then his fingers twitched again, and before she could move, he reached for her hand, weakly, slowly, but on purpose. His hand closed around hers, his grip fragile but steady, like he'd known her forever. Clara's breath caught, her heart pounding. Dr. Miles looked up sharply. "Carlos, do you know who she is?" Carlos didn't answer right away, his brows furrowing, his eyes never leaving Clara's. "I don't know," Carlos murmured, his voice rough from months of silence. "But I feel like I should." A chill ran down Clara's spine. Even though Carlos Navarro didn't remember her, something deep inside him seemed to. His hand stayed wrapped around hers, weak but firm, and his brown eyes held hers with a quiet intensity she couldn't explain. The days after Carlos's miraculous awakening were a whirlwind of tests, therapy, and endless questions. The doctors were stunned by his recovery. Physically, he was weak, his muscles stiff from a year of lying still, but he was getting stronger every day through rehabilitation. Mentally, though, it was a different story. Carlos couldn't recall anything about the accident, and the more they pushed him for answers, the more frustrated he grew. "Let's try again," Dr. Miles said during one of their sessions, sitting across from Carlos in the therapy room. "What's the last thing you remember?" Carlos rubbed his temples, his face tight with strain. I don't know. Nothing clear." "Where you were? What you were doing?" Dr. Miles pressed. Carlos exhaled sharply, his voice sharp. "I told you, it's just pieces, flashes." "Tell me about them," Dr. Miles said, leaning forward. A long silence filled the room. Then Carlos closed his eyes, his brows furrowing. "I remember a feeling," he said slowly, his voice unsure. "Like something was wrong. Like I was in trouble." Clara, who'd been standing quietly by the door, stiffened. Carlos kept going, his fingers clenching the edge of the chair. There was a road, trees, and then nothing, just dark. Dr. Miles sighed. "It's normal for trauma to block memories like that. They might come back on their own. For now, we focus on getting you stronger." Carlos nodded, but Clara could see the tension in his jaw. She felt it too, a nagging sense that something wasn't right. That night, unable to sleep, she slipped into the hospital's records room. She'd skimmed Carlos's file before, but this time she dug deeper, reading every line with fresh eyes. And then she saw it, something she'd missed. The accident report said his truck's brakes had failed, not worn out, not broken by chance, but tampered with. A cold shiver ran through her. This wasn't just a crash. Someone had wanted Carlos dead, and he didn't even know. She took a shaky breath and closed the file. She had to tell him. If someone had tried to kill him once, they might try again. Carlos's recovery moved fast after that. In just a few weeks, he went from being stuck in bed to sitting up, eating on his own, speaking in full sentences. With physical therapy, he was learning to walk again, and Clara was there for every step, every stumble, every moment he wanted to quit. She pulled him back. "I can't do this," Carlos muttered one afternoon, gripping the parallel bars tight as he tried to lift himself. His legs shook under the effort. "Yes, you can," Clara said firmly, standing beside him. "You've already come this far, Carlos. Don't stop now." He turned to look at her, his breathing heavy. She wasn't just saying it to push him. She believed it, and that belief lit something in him. With a hard breath, he took another step forward. Clara's face brightened. That's it. For the first time since waking up, Carlos smiled. Not a polite one, not a forced one, but a real one. He felt alive again, and he knew who to thank. Clara wasn't like the others. She didn't treat him like a hopeless case or a rich man fallen low. She saw him, just Carlos, and that drew him to her. When she was near, the room felt less heavy. When she spoke, her voice chased away the shadows still clinging to his mind. When she touched him, steadying his arm as he walked, fixing his pillow, his skin buzzed with something he couldn't name. One evening, after a long therapy session, Clara suggested a change. Fresh air might help, she said, smiling. Let's walk in the hospital garden. Carlos agreed, though he didn't expect how different it would feel outside those walls. The cool night air brushed his face. The pine trees rustled softly, and the moon cast a gentle glow over everything. For the first time, he felt like a person again. Not a patient, not a puzzle with missing pieces, just himself. And beside him was Clara. They walked slowly, her arm linked with his for support. At first, he thought it was just part of her job, but then he noticed it, the way her fingers lingered on his wrist, the way Clara glanced at Carlos when she thought he wasn't looking, the way her fingers lingered on his wrist, the way her breath caught whenever he stepped too close. Suddenly, he knew. She felt it too. That pull, that quiet connection tying them together. They stopped near a small wooden bench in the hospital garden, the moonlight casting shadows across the pine trees. Carlos turned to face her, his heartbeat unsteady, not from the walk, but from something else. Clara opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, Carlos took her hand. Her lips parted in surprise, her eyes searching his. I don't remember anything about my life before this, he admitted, his voice low, but I know one thing for sure. Clara swallowed. What? He tightened his grip on her fingers just a little. I trust you. The words were simple, but to him they carried everything. And judging by the way Clara's breath hitched, the way her cheeks flushed under the moonlight, the way she didn't pull away, she understood. For now, that was enough. That night was restless. Carlos tossed and turned in his hospital bed, his body still weak but his mind racing. Then it hit. A sudden flash of memory broke through like a dam bursting. The road was dark, rain pounding against the windshield of his truck, the wipers barely keeping up. He gripped the steering wheel tight, his head foggy from a long day at the lumber mill. Something felt wrong, off. Then, out of nowhere, headlights blazed toward him, a dark truck swerving into his lane at full speed. Carlos yanked the wheel, tires sliding on the wet road. The brakes, they didn't work. His heart pounded as he fought to steer, and just before the crash, his eyes flicked to the side of the road. A shadowy figure stood there, watching. Then, blackness. Carlos's eyes snapped open, his breath ragged, sweat sticking to his skin. The memory was so clear, so real. And now he knew. This wasn't an accident. Someone had tried to kill him. Clara saw it the moment she walked into his room the next morning. He was different. No trace of his usual half-smile, his body tense, his hands balled into fists. Carlos, she asked carefully, what's wrong? His deep brown eyes locked onto hers, sharp with a new fire. I remember something, Clara. The accident. It wasn't an accident. Someone messed with my brakes, and there was a man standing there watching my truck go down. Clara felt a cold shiver run through her. Everything she'd suspected from the report was true. He'd just confirmed it. But who? Why? We need to figure this out, she said, her voice steady despite the fear. Carlos nodded, his jaw tight. I'm with you. They spent the next few days digging, going through Carlos's files, company records, anything that might point to someone wanting him gone. Then they found it. A large payment wired days before the crash, sent to a man with a record of tampering vehicles, a hired hand for dirty jobs. The sender? Rachel Turner, Carlos's older sister. The truth hit hard. Rachel, Carlos whispered, gripping the edge of the table. She was always jealous, always thought I stole the company from her, and Dad trusted me to run Turner Mills, not her. She got left behind. Clara's heart sank. She wanted you dead over that? Carlos's eyes darkened, and now she's going to answer for it. That evening, Carlos and Clara set up a meeting with Rachel face to face in the quiet office of the Turner estate. The room was dimly lit, lined with shelves of old ledgers, the air heavy with the scent of pine and leather. Rachel sat in a chair swirling a glass of wine, her smirk sharp as Carlos and Clara walked in. "Well, well," Rachel said, her voice smooth. "The dead man walks." Carlos's eyes burned. "Why did you do it, Rachel?" She took a slow sip, unfazed. "You know why." Clara stepped forward, anger rising. "You tried to kill your own brother for what? The company? Money?" Rachel's smirk faded, her tone turning bitter. "For everything that should have been mine. He was always Dad's favorite. The golden son who got the mills, the glory. I was tired of waiting in the shadows." Carlos's hands clenched into fists. "So you hired someone to cut my brakes?" Rachel laughed, cold and sharp. "I didn't think you'd wake up. Guess miracles happen, huh?" Clara's blood boiled, but before she could speak, the door swung open. 2 police officers stepped inside, their badges glinting in the low light. Rachel's face went pale. "Rachel Turner," one officer said, "you're under arrest for attempted murder." Rachel spun toward Carlos, panic flashing in her eyes. "You set me up." Carlos tilted his head. His eyes locked on Rachel as the officer stepped closer. "No, sister," he said, his voice steady. "You set yourself up." Rachel was dragged away in handcuffs, shouting empty threats that echoed down the hall of the Turner estate. As the door slammed shut behind her, a heavy silence settled over the room. Carlos let out a long breath, his shoulders easing for the first time since he'd woken up. It was over. Justice was done, and he was free. The Turner estate had always been big, cold, and distant, a symbol of power carved from the lumber mills. But that night, as Clara stepped into the quiet dining room, it felt different, warmer, softer. Candlelight flickered across a small table set near the tall windows, the pine-covered hills glowing faintly under the night sky. The air smelled of fresh bread and cedar, and a bottle of juice sat chilling beside 2 simple plates. Clara's breath caught. "Carlos," she said, turning to him, "what's all this?" Carlos stood behind her, hands in his pockets, his brown eyes gentle but strong. "Dinner," he said simply. "Just you and me." Clara's chest tightened. The past few weeks had been a storm, from his recovery to uncovering Rachel's betrayal to watching her get arrested. But now, with the chaos behind them, there was just this moment, and somehow that felt bigger than anything else. As they sat down, Clara couldn't ignore how Carlos watched her, like she was the only thing in the room, like she mattered more than he could say. "You're quiet," she said, giving him a small, teasing smile. "That's not like you." He let out a breath, rolling his glass between his fingers. "I've been thinking." "That's even worse," she joked. He didn't smile. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes holding hers with a quiet fire. "Clara, do you know how many people gave up on me when I was in that coma?" Her smile faded. She knew. She'd seen it herself. His family had drifted away. His workers had moved on, treating him like a memory instead of a man. The only reason he'd come back from that darkness was because someone hadn't given up. Because she hadn't. "But you didn't," Carlos said, his voice low. "You were there, day after day. You took care of me when I couldn't even move, when I was nothing to everyone else. You never stopped believing I'd wake up." Clara's throat tightened. She hadn't thought of it like that. She'd just done what felt right, but to Carlos, it had been everything. He leaned closer, his fingers brushing hers on the table. "Clara," he said, soft but sure, "I've got everything, Mills, money, a name people know, but none of it matters without you." Her breath caught. "Carlos, let me finish," he whispered, his hand closing around hers, his thumb tracing slow circles against her skin. "I don't know how it happened or when it started, but I know this. Every second I was stuck in that coma, you were the one keeping me here. You were my voice in the silence." Clara's eyes stung with tears. "Carlos, I love you," he said, the words hitting her like a wave. Not because she hadn't felt it too, but because hearing it from him made it real. Carlos Navarro, the man who'd once lived for lumber deals and hard work, who'd built a fortune from nothing, was sitting here, opening his heart. And for the first time, Clara felt truly seen, truly needed. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she smiled through them. "Carlos," she whispered, "you don't know how much that means to me." He reached up, wiping a tear from her face with his thumb. "Then let me show you." He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers, and Clara knew this was just the start. Months passed since that night when Carlos poured out his heart. He'd fully recovered. Hours of therapy and hard work had brought his strength back. His body was no longer weak, no longer held down by the crash that nearly ended him. Now he was Carlos Navarro again, standing tall in the offices of Turner Mills, leading with the fire of a man who'd faced death and won. But there was one big difference from the man he'd been before. This time, he wasn't alone. This time, he had Clara, and soon, if she said yes, she'd be his forever. The rooftop of the Turner estate glowed under the soft light of the setting sun, casting warm golden shades across the rolling hills of Willow Creek. Clara stood near the edge, gazing at the breathtaking view, the pine trees swaying gently, the sky painted with streaks of orange and pink. She didn't know what was coming. "It's beautiful up here," she murmured, the breeze tugging at her hair. Carlos stood behind her, a quiet smile on his lips. "Not as beautiful as you." She turned to him, rolling her eyes with a playful grin. "Smooth, Turner, very smooth." But her teasing faded when she saw his eyes. There was something new there, something deep, certain, endless. Before she could ask, he took a shaky breath and slowly dropped to one knee. Clara's breath caught, her hands flying to her mouth as Carlos pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal a simple silver ring with a tiny emerald that sparkled like the forest. It wasn't the ring that stole her breath. It was him, the way his voice shook as he spoke. "Clara, you didn't just save my life. You became my life." Her heart pounded, tears pricking her eyes. "Carlos, before you," he went on, "I had everything, mills, money, a name people respected, but I was missing something. I was missing you." His eyes held hers, steady and true. "You're the reason I fought to wake up, the reason I found myself again. And now I want to spend every day showing you how much you mean to me." He lifted the ring, his voice soft but firm. "Clara Evans, will you marry me?" The world stopped. Clara couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. All she could do was nod, tears and laughter spilling out together. "Yes," she finally choked out, her voice breaking. "Yes, Carlos, 1,000 times, yes." Carlos let out a relieved breath, sliding the ring onto her finger before standing and pulling her into his arms. As their lips met under the fading sunlight, Clara knew this was where she belonged, always. The Turner estate had never looked more alive than on their wedding day. The gardens bloomed with wildflowers, strings of lights twinkled in the oak trees, and soft music floated through the air as friends and family gathered. Clara stood at the edge of the lawn, her white dress simple but elegant, her heart racing. "You ready?" her friend Clara whispered beside her, squeezing her hand. Clara took a deep breath, clutching her small bouquet of daisies. Then she looked up, and there he was. Carlos stood at the end of the aisle, dressed in a dark suit, his brown eyes locked on her like she was the only person in the world. Her nerves melted away. She stepped forward, walking toward him with every bit of certainty she had. Each step brought her closer to forever. When she reached him, Carlos took her hands, his grip warm and sure, his eyes shining with love. The vows they spoke were promises forged through every struggle, every quiet moment, every time she'd refused to let him go. "I promise to stand by you through every storm, every shadow," Carlos said, his voice steady. "You're my light, Clara, and I'll love you forever. I now pronounce you husband and wife." The crowd cheered as Carlos cupped her face, pressing a kiss to her lips that held all the meaning in the world. Clara smiled against him, knowing this wasn't the end. It was the start. As the sun dipped below the hills, Carlos and Clara slipped away from the party, walking hand in hand through the garden, the air cool and quiet. No more hospitals, no more betrayal, no more fear. Just them, together. Carlos squeezed her hand gently. "You know," he murmured, "I thought I had everything before I met you." Clara smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And now?" He looked down at her, his face soft, full of devotion. "Now I know none of that matters. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back, overwhelmed by his words. As they walked toward the golden glow of the sunset, she knew they'd face darkness, crashes, silence near death, but love had pulled them through. With Carlos by her side, Clara was home. Their story became proof of something powerful. Love isn't just about finding someone. It's about holding on through every storm. Clara never gave up on Carlos, even when the world did. And in the end, it was love, not money or mills, that saved him. If this tale warmed your heart, share it with someone who believes in love's strength. And look out for more stories that touch the soul, because sometimes the best love stories start in the quietest places. See you in the next story.